In this alternate timeline, the first major divergence begins in the late 1930s. When the early theoretical work of nuclear fission does not lead to actionable insights, critical experiments by Otto Hahn, Lisa Meitner, and Enrico Fermi yield data, but key interpretations fail to connect the dots needed to envision a chain reaction. Without clear proof of a self-sustaining reaction, governments see no immediate military potential, and funding never materializes. The concept of a superweapon powered by splitting atoms remains purely academic, buried in obscure physics journals. With no Manhattan Project pulling the brightest minds together, the Second World War unfolds with conventional strategies. The war still escalates into massive global conflict, but military planners focus on refining explosives, advancing aircraft technology, and improving logistical systems. The terrifying possibility of instant city destruction never enters their minds, and the war continues to be fought through attrition, manpower, and industrial capacity rather than fears of an ultimate doomsday device. The war in the Pacific ends differently in this timeline. Instead of atomic bombs forcing Japan's surrender, the Allies rely on a combination of naval blockades, intense firebombing, and a massive planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, which never becomes an abandoned plan in our reality, is carried out with catastrophic losses on both sides. Historians later estimate the invasion costs several 100,000 Allied lives and multiple millions of Japanese lives. Japan eventually surrenders after months of brutal resistance, leaving deep scars that shape post-war diplomacy. The absence of nuclear weapons does not prevent the post-war world from becoming tense, but it changes the nature of the Cold War. Instead of a delicate balance based on mutually assured destruction, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union becomes a prolonged competition of conventional power, economic systems, proxy wars, and propaganda. Each superpower tries to outdo the other with massive standing armies, advanced aircraft, chemical weapons, and conventional bomb payloads. Without nukes acting as a deterrent, many political scientists argue that the Cold War becomes more violent, not less. Both sides believe large-scale conventional wars are still winnable, which increases the chance of miscalculation. Small proxy conflicts intensify, and the arms race becomes focused on the quantity of ships, missiles, tanks, and bombers rather than apocalyptic weapons few actually want to use. In Europe, NATO and the Warsaw Pact maintain enormous troop numbers along the Iron Curtain. Western Europe becomes even more militarized than in our timeline, with Germany, France, and Britain keeping larger armies to compensate for the lack of nuclear deterrence. The threat of tank battles sweeping across Central Europe looms constantly over civilians, who experience frequent air raid drills and heightened civil defense preparations. One of the most profound effects is the acceleration of chemical and biological weapons research, because nations still crave strategic war-ending capabilities. They invest heavily in toxins, contagions, and psychological agents. International treaties eventually attempt to ban these weapons, but enforcement is weak. Secret stockpiles grow, and several crises throughout the 20th century revolve around suspected use of biological agents in isolated incidents. The Korean War plays out similarly at first, but without nuclear threats hanging over Chinese or American leadership, the conflict escalates further. The war drags on until 1955, 2 years longer than in our timeline, as both sides pour in troops and equipment. The result is a more destructive stalemate and a Korea even more devastated, fueling a greater refugee crisis and deeper resentment toward outside powers. The Vietnam War also changes significantly. Without the looming threat of nuclear intervention from China or the USSR, the United States considers much larger-scale invasions of North Vietnam. Several offensives nearly bring the US and China into direct conflict, edging the world dangerously close to a major conventional war. Though nuclear escalation isn't possible, the sheer number of troops involved creates global anxiety. Space exploration develops at a slower pace in this scenario. In our real history, nuclear fears pushed governments to invest heavily in missile technology, which helped launch satellites and spacecraft. Without this intense missile competition, rocketry advances more gradually. Yuri Gagarin still orbits Earth first. The moon landing occurs later, sometime in the late 1970s rather than 1969, after years of budget, constraints, and less urgency. On the flip side, energy research takes a radically different path. Without military investment, nuclear energy is seen as too expensive and too theoretical to become widespread quickly. Instead, nations double down on coal, oil, hydropower, and emerging renewable sources. Environmental consequences become severe in the 1950s through the 1970s, accelerating interest in solar and wind earlier than in our world. The Middle East experiences a different geopolitical trajectory. Without nuclear programs becoming flashpoints in Iran, Israel, India, or Pakistan, tensions still exist but revolve around conventional power, economic leverage, and alliances. The Israel-Arab conflicts are more frequent and more conventional. In India, Pakistan skirmishes are more common but less catastrophic, since no nuclear threat holds leaders back. The Cuban Missile Crisis becomes non-existent, as nuclear missiles are never developed. Instead, the United States and the USSR clash over influence in Latin America through political coups, propaganda, and small proxy battles. Cuba still aligns with the Soviets, but there is no world-threatening standoff that nearly ends civilization. While the world avoids the existential dread of nuclear annihilation, it faces a different fear: the possibility of endless, large-scale conventional wars. Politicians and generals always believe victory is possible, so peace negotiations are often delayed or dismissed. Humanitarian organizations grow in power during the 20th century as civilian casualties skyrocket in prolonged regional wars. The arms race between the superpowers is no less expensive. Instead of investing in a few thousand nuclear warheads, both nations pour unimaginable resources into millions of conventional munitions, colossal air fleets, and armored divisions. Economically, this strains both nations. But the USSR collapses later around the mid-1990s because the cost of sustaining a massive conventional force becomes unsustainable. Without the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons, the Gulf War in 1991 unfolds similarly, but has different post-war consequences. The U.S. maintains a larger and more permanent military presence in the Gulf to deter future conflicts, since the threat of nuclear retaliation cannot exist. This reshapes regional politics, intensifies anti-Western sentiment, and gives rise to more aggressive extremist networks. In Africa, Cold War rivalry results in even more foreign involvement than in our timeline. Superpowers heavily arm client states with advanced conventional weapons. Several civil wars last longer and claim more lives, causing slower economic development across the continent. Europe in the late 20th century experiences periodic scares that resemble our world. It's Cuban Missile Crisis, but with tanks or aircraft instead of nukes. Border incidents along the German frontier, disputes over airspace, and naval standoffs increase the sense of volatility. Diplomatic channels eventually improve, but Europe lives under constant tension until the 1990s. The breakup of the Soviet Union triggers a series of conflicts across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But without nuclear stockpiles to secure, the danger takes a different form. Former Soviet states inherit massive conventional arsenals, leading to regional arms races and occasional border battles. Global powers focus on preventing chemical weapons proliferation rather than nuclear proliferation. China's rise in the 21st century also plays out differently. Without nuclear deterrence, China invests even more aggressively in naval and air power to secure regional dominance. The South China Sea becomes a hotspot for periodic clashes with neighbors. The United States responds by reinforcing alliances with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, creating a more confrontational Pacific landscape. Terrorism evolves in a distinct way. Without nuclear fears, states and terror groups instead pursue cyber attacks, chemical agents, and infrastructure sabotage. The world sees several major chemical incidents in the 1990s and 2000s, which lead to strict global agreements and new intelligence networks focused on unconventional threats. Culturally, the absence of nuclear weapons changes global psychology. The existential dread that shaped Cold War literature, movies, and music never dominates society. Films like Dr. Strangelove, The Day After, and Terminator 2 never exist in recognizable form. Instead, popular culture focuses on large-scale conventional wars, espionage thrillers, and political conspiracies. Science fiction also evolves differently. Without the iconic mushroom cloud imagery, speculative works explore alternate types of superweapons. Directed energy weapons, orbital bombardments, nanotechnology plagues, and advanced bioweapons become the favorite tropes for depicting doomsday scenarios in literature and film. International diplomacy attempts multiple times to ban chemical and biological weapons, but enforcement is inconsistent. Some nations cheat, believing these weapons offer a partial substitute for nuclear deterrence. Intelligence agencies therefore devote enormous resources to monitoring laboratories around the world. Environmentalism becomes a dominant global movement earlier than in our timeline. as fossil fuel reliance grows unchecked and nuclear energy is not widely adopted. Climate conferences start decades before they did historically, though political action remains slow and contentious. The European Union forms more slowly, as fears of a major continental war delay economic cooperation. However, by the late 2000s, Europe finally stabilizes and unites economically, arguing that only deep integration can prevent yet another devastating war on the continent. Global technology develops faster in some fields and slower in others. Military computing grows rapidly due to constant conventional war preparation, which accelerates early computing breakthroughs. However, peaceful applications such as nuclear medicine or reactor technology lag significantly behind, leading to slower development in energy security, medical isotopes, and advanced materials. By the 2020s, the world is still tense but less apocalyptic. There is no threat of instant global annihilation, but the risk of regional wars spiraling into prolonged conflicts remains high. Diplomats constantly work to prevent conventional arms races from overwhelming fragile economies. In this nuclear-less world, humanity learns a very different lesson about conflict. Instead of being terrified into caution by the destructive power of atomic weapons, nations remain bold, aggressive, and willing to escalate disputes. Some historians argue that nuclear weapons, despite their horror, prevented World War III by making global leaders more cautious. Without that fear, the world experiences more frequent large-scale wars, but fewer civilization-ending threats. Ultimately, this alternate history shows a world that is neither safer nor more peaceful, simply different. Without nuclear weapons, the world avoids the specter of total annihilation, but suffers the consequences of unchecked conventional warfare, unstable geopolitical rivalries, and rapid escalation of regional conflicts. Humanity continues to strive for peace, but without the sobering reminder of nuclear devastation, the path is far more turbulent, proving that world stability depends not only on the weapons we create, but also on the wisdom we fail to use.